She didn't make a sound when the floor gave way. That was the first thing Thomas Vance noticed. A woman running for her life out. Here usually came with noise, heavy boots, tearing brush, or a breath that rattled like dry beans in a tin. But Clara didn't have any breath left to waste. She had just dragged herself across the threshold of the old lambing barn, her fingers clawing at the packed dirt floor until her nails filled with gray dust. Before her knees finally buckled under her, Thomas didn't rush. At 52, a man who lived 40 miles outside of Tascosa learns that rushing in the middle of the drought only kicks up dust you can't see. Through, he stood by the corral rail, holding a wire stretcher, his Stetson, pulled low against the sun that felt less like warmth and more like an open furnace. He watched her for 3 long beats of his heart. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 20, was wrapped in a man's heavy wool coat that swallowed her frame. Her bare feet were caked in red alkali mud, bruised black around the ankles where something tight had bitten in and stayed. Thomas laid the wire stretcher across the fence rail. His joints popped once, dry as cedar kindling, as he walked over. He didn't tower over her. He kept his boots 3 paces back, giving her the circle of dirt she claimed. "You missed the town by about 6 miles, miss," Thomas said. His voice was like gravel rolling down a chute, low, flat, and scrubbed clean as surprise. "Unless you were looking for the stage road. That's behind the ridge." Clara didn't answer. She didn't even look up at his face. Her eyes were fixed on the hem of his trousers, wide and glassy, trembling like a marsh rabbit caught between 2 stones. One of her hands stayed balled up tight against her coat pocket, as if she were holding on to a live coal and dared anyone to pry her. Fingers loose. "I ain't here to move you," Thomas added, his tone softening just enough to let the heat settle around them. "And I ain't got company coming. If you need to, sit." He turned his back on purpose, not out of carelessness, but to give her the one thing the road hadn't: privacy. He walked to the water trough, dipped a clean tin dipper, and set it down in the dirt halfway between them. Then he backed up to the porch steps and waited. It took her 5 minutes. 5 minutes of shallow, hitching breaths before she crawled forward on her elbows, her teeth clamped so hard together her jaw. Muscles stood out like walnuts. She snatched the dipper, drank so fast she choked, coughed until her ribs seized, and then wiped her mouth with the back of a cracked hand. "They're coming," she whispered. Her voice scraped raw. Thomas didn't ask who they were. Out here, you didn't need a name tag to know. Trouble. You just had to look at the direction the dust was blowing. "Let 'em come," Thomas said quietly. "They'll find the gate shut." That evening, the heat didn't lift with the sun. It simply settled closer to the floor, turning the ranch house into a box of baked pine and old grease. Thomas sat by the small oil lamp at the kitchen table, running an oiled rag down the barrel of his Spencer carbine. Clara sat across from him in a cane bottom chair, still wearing his oversized coat. She hadn't eaten more than 3 bites of salt pork and cold biscuit, but she had finally opened her fist. On the scar between them lay a heavy, square-cut iron key and a scrap of paper torn from a ledger. "He said it was just cattle tally," Clara murmured, staring at the yellow flame of the wick. "My uncle, when he died down in Silver City, he left me his little patch of bottomland and this key," said the box under the old barn floor would keep me out of the poorhouse. Thomas glanced at the paper. The ink was faded, written in a neat, clerkish hand that listed numbers of beeves, brands that didn't match any herd within 100 miles, and 4 distinct XS marked beside the name Garrett. Vance, Thomas's own younger brother, who hadn't written a letter since the winter of '84. "Garrett's been dead 6 years," Thomas said, his thumb stopping its motion on the rifle steel. "He ain't dead," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, steadying with a cold, terrifying certainty. "He just changed his name. And he didn't leave me bottomland in that box, Mr. Vance. He left a paper trail of every man he's helped the railroad clear out of the valley. And somebody in Tascosa wants those Page's back bad enough to burn every ranch between here and the river. Thomas felt that old, familiar knot form behind his ribs. The kind that told him the quiet life he'd carved out of this dry dirt was about to be turned over by a plow. Before he could answer, the gate bell rang. It wasn't a hard ring, just a single metallic clink from the iron tongue. Hitting the horseshoe-rimmed Thomas had hung by the front latch to catch stray cattle. Thomas didn't blow out the lamp. He didn't dive for the window. He simply sat, the rag down, stood up, and tucked the Spencer into the crook of his arm. "Stay in the pantry," he told Clara. "Mr. Vance." "Go." He walked to the front door, unlatched it, and stepped out onto the porch just as a horse's hoof crunched the gravel by the horse trough. The rider didn't dismount. He sat tall in the saddle, his shadow stretching long and dark across the yard under a moonless sky. Even in the dark, Thomas knew the silhouette. It was a square set of the shoulders, the high-crowned beaver hat, and the way the left stirrup leather creaked a fraction louder than the right. "Evening, brother," Deputy U.S. Marshal Garrett Vance said, his voice smooth as rendered lard. "I hear you've taken in a stray." Thomas didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't raise it either. He leaned his weight against the porch post. The scar would cool against his palm. "You're a long way from the federal bench in Santa Fe, Garrett," Thomas said, "and you're standing on private grass." Garrett nudged his bay forward 2 steps, the moonlight catching the silver star, pinned to his wool vest. He didn't look like a man who spent his days chasing cattle rustlers. His boots were clean, his gloves new, and his smile had the easy, practiced warmth of a preacher collecting tithes after a good harvest. "Just doing a circuit, Tom," Garrett replied, leaning forward over the saddle. "Horn. Word gets around when a girl runs off with property that don't belong to her, especially when that property happens to be tied up in a federal land grant investigation." "She ain't property," Thomas said, his voice flat as a washboard. "That's for a judge to decide, and for me to escort back." Garrett's eyes flicked past Thomas toward the dark window of the house. "She's got something of mine, Tom. A little box, wood with iron strapping. You hand it over, and I can ride back south and tell the boys I missed her. We keep this clean. No warrants. No questions from the circuit judge about why my brother's living out here on land that hasn't paid taxes since Cleveland took office." Thomas felt a cold rage rise in his chest. Not the hot, blind flash of a boy, but the cold, heavy fury of a man who's watched a snake coil under his porch too, many times. "Garrett," Thomas said softly, "you always were a poor hand at farming. You couldn't grow wheat, you couldn't keep a calf alive, and it looks like you never learned how to make an honest living either." Garrett's smile didn't break, but his fingers tightened on the reins until his knuckles showed white. "That girl doesn't know what she's holding, Tom. Those papers will hang half the rail contractors between here and El Paso, including men who pay my salary. Now, are you going to give me the box, or am I going to have to deputize a couple of boys from town to come help me search the premises?" Thomas shifted his weight. "There ain't no box here, Garrett." "Then I guess we'll just have to look." Garrett reached down toward the pearl-handled Colt strapped to his thigh. He never cleared leather. The front door didn't slam open. It simply drifted back on its grease hinges. Clara stood in the doorway, holding the heavy, square-cut iron key out in front of her like a crucifix, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "He ain't got the box, Marshal," she called out, the terror entirely gone from her tone, replaced by something sharper and colder. "Because I buried it under the east corner of the sheep dip 3 hours ago, and a copy of the Telegraph. Orders is already on a morning stage to the U.S. District Attorney in Denver." Garrett froze. His hand hovered an inch above his holster, his eyes darting from Clara to Thomas, the mask finally slipping to reveal the desperate, cornered rat underneath. "You lying little," Garrett snarled, kicking his horse forward. Thomas didn't hesitate. He didn't aim for the chest or the head. He stepped off the porch and brought the barrel of the Spencer down across the bay's nose with a dull, wet thud. The animal reared, snorting in panic, wheeling around and dumping Garrett hard into the dry dirt of the horse lot. Before the marshal could scramble to his feet, Thomas had his boot planted, squarely between Garrett's shoulder blades, pressing him down into manure. And dust. "Stay down, Garrett," Thomas whispered, leaning his weight into the man who had traded his blood for a silver star and a railroad bribe. "The last time you tried to steal from this family, you left me to take the blame for the fire. I ain't feeling that charitable tonight." By sunrise, the dust on the road had settled, replaced by the steady, rhythmic trample of 3 heavy mounts coming up from the south. They weren't Garrett's hired thugs. They wore the flat-brimmed hats and dusty blue coats of federal marshals out of Santa Fe, men who had received a packet, delivered by the early stage, containing a ledger page for excess and an iron key that unlocked the truth about every land grab from Tascosa to the border. Garrett sat tied to the corral post, his clean coat smeared with horse manure, watching in silence as his badge was unpinned by his own superior and dropped into the dirt like a used cartridge. Thomas stood on the porch, a tin cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. Clara sat beside him on the bench, her boots finally clean, her shoulders dropped an inch from where they'd been when she first crawled through the dust. Neither of them spoke as the marshals hauled Garrett up and shoved him into the back of the wagon. "You fixing to stay, Clara?" Thomas asked quietly, blowing the steam off his coffee. She looked out across the valley, where the morning light was turning to red, dirt the color of copper, stretching out to a horizon that finally looked wide enough to breathe in. "I reckon I am," she said, a small, real smile touching the corner of her mouth. "Provided you teach me how to fix that broken wire on the east pasture. Looks like you've been putting it off." Thomas grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh 20 years ago. He set his cup down, picked up his hat, and stepped off the porch into the bright, unsparing morning. "Now, let me step out of the story for a moment and speak plain. We've all known a Garrett in our lives, someone who wears a badge of respectability, smiles while he picks your pocket, and counts on the fact that most folks are too tired, too scared, or too polite to call him out. Out here in the West, we like to think justice arrives with a 6-gun and a smoking barrel. But the truth is, the heaviest things in this life, the things that actually bring down corrupt men, aren't bullets. They're ledgers, receipts, and the simple courage of someone who refuses to stay quiet. Thomas didn't win because he was the fastest draw. He won because he finally stopped letting his brother's shadow dictate his silence. So, let me ask you something, and don't answer too fast. What's the lie you've been letting sit under your floorboards just to keep the peace? And if the day came when you had to choose between an easy silence and the hard, dusty truth, would you open the door? If this story hit you somewhere quiet, take a second to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to send these gritty Western tales to more folks who still appreciate a story with a backbone. And if you want to ride along for the next one, hit subscribe and stay close. Until next time, keep your boots clean, your powder dry, and remember, the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs someone brave enough to dig it.